Hey, good morning, Anchored Youth. No, you did not click the wrong link. This is Pastor Paul. Ben and I swapped today, so he's doing the sermon and I'm here. Aren't you lucky? Now, my apologies in advance. I'm not as tall or as funny or as bald as Ben, and I will try hard to not overcompensate by being cool. I'm told that is cringy. So, that said, the other night, my family, we were playing the game of life. And if you know the game of life, like according to the rules of the game of life, whoever retires earliest and has the largest pile of money at the end, they win. And that got me thinking, like in real life, what's a win? Like if you think about it, real question here. What does it look like to win in life? What is a good life? Like, is it retiring as early as possible with as much money as possible? So I want you to do this. Before we start off today and jump into the text, I want you to pause the video and discuss this question. When you dream about what your life could be, what you imagine it could be, like what happens? Where would you live? How do other people treat you? What do you own? What do you do? Pause the video real quick. Discuss that, and then press play when you're ready. Okay, so today, I'm not sure if you did that, but today, let me tell you where we're going to go. Today, we're going to look at one of the greatest success stories in all of the Scriptures. Over and over and over again, we're told in this passage that this life is blessed by God, that this is success, that this is what a good life looks like. And it all begins with the story of a 17-year-old boy who's a slave, and his name is Joseph. So last week, Ben shared Joseph's backstory, if you listened in. He was Dad's perfect son. All the other brothers came to Jacob and were like, Dad, it seems like you favor Joseph and you like him more than us. And Jacob was like, yeah, it's true, I do. Which is a really bad thing. Examples of what not to do as a parent. And Jacob buys Joseph a fancy coat of many colors. Would have been super expensive. And Joseph's like flitting around with this coat that screams, Dad likes me more than you. And then he tells his brothers about this dream I had. I had this dream that all of you someday are going to bow down to me. Isn't that great? And for some reason, his brothers hate him. And they want to kill him. So yeah, they throw him into this pit. And then they decide, no, I've got an even better idea. Judah says, here's an even better idea. Here's this caravan of Ishmaelites traveling down to Egypt. And as they pass by, Judah gets the idea, let's pull him out of the pit, let's sell him as a slave, at least we can make money off of him. So, that's what they did. And when we pick up the story today, in Genesis chapter 39, Joseph has just been hauled in this caravan, sold off as a slave, hauled in this caravan down to Egypt. Let's read Genesis chapter 39, starting in verse 1. It reads like this. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. So Potiphar is this super important official in Egypt, and Egypt was this superpower at the time. Really, really important nation, the most powerful nation in the world, and Potiphar's this big deal there. He buys Joseph to work at his house. Now, if you're Joseph, I want you to think about this. You have to be thinking, it can't get worse than this. I was Dad's favorite son. I had this amazing coat and all these amazing things. And now I'm literally a slave in a foreign country. But the text says nothing about that. The text says nothing about how bad it was. Look at what the text does say, though. In verse 2, it says this. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. And he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. So he's a slave, but because God is with him, the text says he prospered. He's a slave, but God makes him successful. Verse 3. When his master saw the Lord was with him, and that the Lord had gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care, with Joseph in charge. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. And I want you to see this here. This right here, we see this contrast, this delicious contrast here that we need to savor. Joseph is a slave and a success. He is cursed and hated by his brothers, but blessed by God. He's abandoned and rejected by his family, but God is with him, the text says. Joseph is a slave and he's a success. Now listen to this. Maybe you've been bullied. Maybe you felt abandoned or rejected. Maybe you feel like you're a nobody, the way Joseph was just a slave. But in this story, you begin to hear God whisper, these things, these circumstances don't define your life. I do. So here's a question for discussion. Have you ever experienced God's blessing, His favor, in a bad situation? Have you ever come into circumstances that are externally terrible circumstances, like Joseph is right now? He's sold into slavery, and yet somehow God is blessing you in that. Pause the video for a moment and take a chance to discuss that around the table if you want. Press play when you're ready. Okay, I'm not sure if you paused there, but here we move from God blessing Joseph in this terrible circumstance, and then verse 6 ends with this juicy detail just to tease us. It says, "Now Joseph was well built and handsome." The point here, of course, is that Joseph is a hottie. He is the Zac Efron of the ancient Near East, or whoever people are infatuated with these days. The lesson actually skips this part of the story, but the story goes like this. Potiphar's wife looks at Joseph and says, wow, he's amazing, and she wants to cheat on her husband with Joseph. So she tries and tries and tries to get Joseph to go along, but Joseph will have nothing to do with it. Now, as an aside, and as a pastor, and as a father of a middle school girl, please hear me. Genesis chapter 39 is a text that all of you should read and know. Genesis chapter 39, you guys might not be in the full-on hormonal madness that is the teenage years. But before you get there, you should read this text. And you middle school boys in particular, I want you to memorize it. Take it to heart. This will show you what is coming for you. Temptation is coming. Do you know how you're going to handle it? Now, that being said, the story ends when Potiphar's wife grabs Joseph by the coat, by the robe, and Joseph, the only way he can escape is to slip out of his robe and run out of the house in his underwear. Now, if things weren't already bad enough, he's running out of the house in his underwear and he's a slave, it gets a lot worse, because then in order to cover up what just happened, she creates a lie about Joseph. And that's where we pick up the story in verse 19, chapter 39, verse 19. When his master heard this story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," the lie that she told Potiphar. He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So just when you think, like, Joseph can't slip any lower in life, he's a slave. He's been hated by his brother, falsely accused. Just when you think it can't get any worse, he's now a prisoner, the very bottom of society, complete non-human. Now, if you're Joseph, what do you think you're going through right now? You have to be thinking, like, this is awful. Life can't get any worse. I must be cursed. My life is terrible. But the text doesn't say any of that. Look at what the text does say in verse 20. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those he held in prison. He made him responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything else under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph. He gave him success in whatever he did. So Joseph is a prisoner, and a success. He's falsely accused and rejected by others, but blessed by God. He's hated by the world, but God shows him kindness. He's abandoned by everyone, but God is with him. He's a prisoner, and he is a success. So as the story goes, while Joseph's sitting there in prison, God gives him the ability to interpret dreams. And he uses this gift a few times. And then after years in prison, Pharaoh has this dream that he can't interpret, and he hears about this guy in the prison who can interpret dreams. So he calls to have Joseph sent up to him. And we read this. This is a couple chapters later in chapter 41, verse 14. We'll pick up the story. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. So this is Joseph's big moment. He is before, literally at the time, he's before the most powerful, most wealthy man in the world at the time. This is his chance to get out of prison, to find success, to find wealth, to find the good life that he's always been seeking. This is the man who could change his fortunes just like this, to take him out of prison, to make him wealthy, to make him someone. So what are you going to say? What are you going to say, Joseph? Verse 16. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh. He says, I can't do it. I can't interpret dreams. How could I possibly do that? I can't answer your questions. I can't make myself impressive. I can't make myself successful. I can't make myself blessed. I can't achieve the good life. But then he goes on. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. I can't do it, but God will. And we see through this story, through these 3 chapters, through rejection, being abandoned, falsely accused, through slavery, through prison, through being overlooked, Joseph has learned that circumstances don't determine his success. God does. What makes Joseph's life good and successful has nothing to do with money or position or being popular or being accepted. What makes Joseph's life good, what makes it a success, is that the Lord is with him. And here's the good news. This isn't just true of Joseph. Circumstances don't define your success in life. God does. Circumstances don't define your success in life. God does. So Jesus came down to earth as the beloved Son of the Father, just as Joseph was the beloved son of his father. Jesus came down, but his brothers, us, humanity, hated him. They rejected him. They betrayed him. They abandoned him. They falsely accused him. And finally, they nailed him to a cross. By every worldly measure, Jesus was a failure. He had no money. He had no position. He didn't get to retire early. His friends abandoned him. But 3 days later, we hear God not just whisper, but shout. These things don't define success. I do. And God raised him from the dead. So, just before Jesus now having defeated sin and death, the proof that he is blessed by God, that he is the definition of success, that he can show us what life is, what the good life is, then just before Jesus ascended into heaven, he commanded his followers, you and me, he commanded us that we should teach this way of life, that success in life is not dependent on circumstances. It's not on what we can achieve, but it's on life with God. It's on God alone can give us success. And then he promised, listen to the last promise he told us before he ascended into heaven. He said, surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. I am with you. The same way that God was with Joseph in Potiphar's house and in prison and in the palace, Jesus promises, I am with you. Now here's the questions I want to close with, and just leave this for you to reflect on after the video. Question number 1. What do you think it might look like for a middle school student to truly believe that God determines his or her success in life? Not circumstances, not popularity, not being accepted by others, not being rejected by others, but life with God truly determines your success in life, what would that look like? And question number 2, what can you do this week to increase your trust that Jesus is with you, not only when things are good, but especially when things are bad? What can you do to increase your trust that Jesus is with you in all the time? All right, with that, thanks for having me today. Ben will be back next week. Until then, know that God is with you, and don't lick shopping carts.